Today's conversation is sponsored by MALA, the Muslim American Leadership Alliance, and is part of our collaborative initiative B'nai Adam, B'nai Adam Restoring Humanity, which seeks to bring together our unique, diverse communities to foster a healthy and impactful exchange of dialogue, dispel myths, and build solidarity that transcends beyond borders and religion. It is now my honor to introduce today's guests. His Eminence, Imam Mohamad Jebara, is a world-renowned scholar from Canada, known for his deep expertise in Semitic languages, Islamic jurisprudence, and Quranic studies. A child prodigy, Imam Jebara memorized the Quran by age 12 and founded an academy at age 13 to make advanced Islamic learning accessible to Western audiences. He has authored 109 books on a wide range of topics, including the acclaimed biography Muhammad the World Changer, and his most recent book is The Life of the Quran. Imam Jebara has served as Chief Imam to diverse global communities and gained recognition for his efforts to bridge cultural and religious divides. He is also a philanthropist known for his charitable bike-a-thon supporting causes such as women's health and international development. A frequent lecturer and advisor to global leaders, Imam Jebara advocates for the relevance of traditional Islamic wisdom in addressing modern challenges. Joining Imam Jebara today is Robert Siegel. Robert was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine All Things Considered for 30 years. He was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism and has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Currently, he hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rabin Medical Center on the JBS. Robert is a special contributor to Moment magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Please welcome Imam Mohamad Jebara and Robert Siegel.
Suzanne, thank you very much. And Mohamad, it's good to talk with you again.
A great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me with you today.
I should say that we are here to talk about your work and about religion, not to talk about either the conflict in the Middle East or the potential conflict over forcing Canada to become the 51st state. But you have written a book about the Quran, and before that, recently, a book about the Prophet Muhammad. I find your writing very interesting, very accessible, and very different from much of what I've read about those subjects in the past. We're focusing on the Quran, your most recent book. So let's begin with a very basic question. If you have to tell someone who is completely new to this subject, what's the Quran? What is the answer in a nutshell?
Oh, that's a very difficult question. But the Quran simply is a living work of guidance. That's basically, in a nutshell, if you want to say, what is the Quran? It is a book of guidance. It is a manual, and it is seen as something that is alive. It's something that's dynamic. So the Quran, even though the Quran can be bound in the form of a book, the Quran is not a book. So in Islamic scholarship, we don't call the book the Quran. We call the book a mushaf, which is like a book.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the Quran itself, so we can't say that this is the Quran. I mean, obviously it's not. This is the book, it's my book. But we refer to the book itself, the book form, as a mushaf. The Quran is something that is not paper or ink. It is the living, the living dynamic example of these teachings when they are applied in day-to-day life. I think that's the simplest way I can explain it.
And it is, of course, in Arabic.
Correct. It is in it's called Quranic Arabic. It's very fascinating because you have classical Arabic, which is the language that is formed after the Quran comes, and then you have ancient Arabic, which is the language before the Quran. And when Arab scholars were trying to define where does the Quran stand in all of these categories of literary definitions, it didn't fit in any pre-existing definition. So therefore they had to categorize as its own definition as Quranic Arabic. So it's very strange, but at the same time it's extremely compelling for anyone who's interested in literature, because the Quran is very unique. It's not like anything written before, and it's not like anything that came after. It has its own style, its own rhythm, etc.
Yes, there are oddities about the Quran that you call postmodern.
Yes.
There's not a consistent narrator of the Quran,
Correct.
and nor is the narrator addressing the same people.
Audiences, correct.
Sometimes it's a plural person listening, sometimes it's a singular.
Correct, yes. So the Quran is very dynamic in that way. So the audiences change, the speaker changes based on the context. The entire style, the best way to describe the storytelling of the Quran is like a film. I'll give you an example. In the Quran's telling of the story of Joseph, you have Jacob is with the sons. He's speaking to them about what they're going to do when they get to Egypt. The next scene, they're in Egypt,
Mhm.
right? So it's like jumping from scene to
Jump
scene.
cut, yeah.
It's fascinating. It's almost like a film. So it doesn't give you, like, if you look at the biblical narrative, it gives you a lot of details. Then they did this, and then they did this, and then so on, etc. The Quran doesn't do that. It jumps from scene to scene. So you're in one scene, you're in Pharaoh's palace. The other scene, you're Moses with the Israelites. Almost like a movie. It's like you're watching a modern film, and it's something that's very strange because you don't see that in any of the ancient scriptures or ancient writings. People don't jump from scene to scene, which the Quran does quite regularly, actually. And
And
sometimes it's telling a story and interrupts it to go and talk about something else, and then it comes back. So it's really interesting in that as well.
something I really didn't know is that it also rhymes.
Yes, the entire Quran rhymes, correct. And that's what makes it easier to memorize, because we memorize the Quran word for word, and the rhyme and rhythm makes it easier to memorize because we chant it. So it's always chanted. We don't just read it or say it. So we describe the our it becomes a it's, I don't say it's a musical, but it's a mystic expression.
Mhm,
It's very spiritual,
mhm.
the expression. So you put your heart into it, you put your soul into it, and you feel it. So it's something that you're feeling as you're chanting. And there's a lot of emotion intertwined with the insistence on the logic and the rational at the same time.
Who is the reader you're most hopeful that you hope most will see and read your book about the Quran?
I I've written the books, at least when I wrote them, my intent was for them to be accessible to the widest audience possible. So to everyone, regardless of their background, whether they believe in anything or not, whether they are staunch believer or not. Uh, but of course, my primary target audiences were mainly people between the age of 16 and 40, because I thought, okay, this is the age where people are, at least in theory, tend to be more flexible and open to considering different ideas. But in the end, the books are intended to be for all people, whether you're a scholar or a lay person. They're supposed to speak to you at some level, at some dimension.
Well, I'm not in your target audience. I haven't been for quite a while, but
I mean, I'm not in my target audience too, because I'm older than that. So
now I want to ask you about a word. Okay, there's a word that you place very centrally in
yes,
of what the Quran is all about, and the word is blossom.
yes.
It is used, the Arabic word, I believe, that
It's
you're
qara, yes. Iqra.
is used in the very first revelation that the Prophet
Correct.
experiences when a voice says, seizes his body and declares. One of the words he declares, as you translate, is blossom, blossom.
Yes.
So,
Mhm.
here's what I don't understand. This is the English translation of the Quran that I've had on my bookshelf for the past
Yes.
20 years. It's Professor Abdul Hadim from University of London. And I wanted
Yes.
to look up and see because I haven't associated the Quran with blossoming as much as,
Mhm.
and he translates the same word as reed.
Yes.
I find it a little odd because most of the people Muhammad was preaching to couldn't
They
read
were,
it.
they were illiterate, correct?
But apart from that, just as a matter of translation and understanding what you have done here, how does the same text in Arabic get to blossom, the verb to blossom in your version, and the verb to read in I gather a more conventional translation?
Yes, so most people today, if you look at the majority of translations, they use either recite or read.
Yes.
So more or less, right? What I did in my translations, so all the translations in both books, I did them myself directly from the original. So I didn't use any translation that anyone had ever done before. What I did is I said, I'm going to allow the Quran to speak for itself. Because a big part of what happens with translation, and I do speak about it in the introductions of both books, I do speak about it in the author's note, that the way translations generally work is that you have religious doctrinal understandings of certain concepts. For example, if you have a particular theology or a particular understanding of something, you're going to go back to the scripture and you're going to try to make sure that the words in the scripture are going to support your theology or your doctrine. And that's going to impact the way you translate. So that's the first. The second is language evolves. With any language, like English has evolved so drastically in the last 100 years. So things that were used 100 years ago, they don't have the same meaning anymore. Common words like you see all the time. The Arabic language had evolved so drastically. We are told that 70 years after Prophet Muhammad's death, that the Umayyad kings in Damascus, the Umayyad rulers, so the people who were ruling the Umayyad dynasty, the Umayyad empire, they ruled out of Damascus. They were Arab natives. They were Arab-speaking people who came from Mecca originally. These people did not speak other languages. Maybe they spoke them as second or third languages, but Arabic, at least Arabic was their mother tongue, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So we are told that 70 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, we're talking about around the year 702, they could not understand the Arabic, the Arabic that was spoken by isolated tribes in Arabia who still spoke the same Arabic in which the Quran was revealed. They couldn't understand it. They had to get a translator or an interpreter because the Arabic language they were speaking had evolved so drastically. The words were still the same, but the words had changed their meaning. So the meanings were no longer the same. So the connotation had changed so drastically that they needed an interpreter. So if that's the case, 70 years after the Prophet, after the completion of the Quran, because the Quran is officially completed the year 15 days before the Prophet Muhammad dies. So 70 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death would mean 70 years after the Quran's completion, that the language had evolved so drastically. Ibn Khaldun, the famous writer, tells us hundreds of years later as well that the Arabic language had also evolved so drastically by his time. So we see there's an evolution that's taking place. People have this assumption, this false assumption that the Arabic language has been exactly the same and modern standard Arabic that is used in the media today or by broadcasters in the Arab world is the exact same Arabic used in the Quran, and therefore the words have the exact same. Yes, you do have words that have the same meaning that have not changed, but you do have a lot of words that have evolved drastically. I'll give you a prime example. A big example is the word irhab. So in modern standard Arabic, the word irhab is the standard accepted word for terrorism. So an irhabi is a terrorist. So if you look in the Arab media, every time they use the word irhab or irhabi, it means terrorist, terrorism, terrorize. But the word in the Quran, yurhibuna, which is the same, which they would translate in modern Arabic as to terrorize, in the Quranic Arabic, it means to behave in such an exquisite exceptional manner that you can earn people's respect and reverence. People will learn to revere you because your behavior is so exemplary, especially when you are undergoing great harm. So people are abusing you, and because of your high ethics and your high morals, you earn the respect of people who were previously your enemies. That is irhab.
So it sounds like someone hijacked the word at some point.
Of course, the word changed. Of course, the meaning changed with time because the word evolved. And of course, the problem is not that language evolves. The problem is when you don't recognize that language has evolved and you translate the Quran with the modern understanding of the way the language is. It's kind of like saying, you know what, I'm going to take a modern English dictionary and I'm going to use the meanings in the modern English dictionary to go back to the works of Shakespeare or the works of Chaucer or the works of Milton or anybody else and say, well, you know what these people were saying means this because that's what it means today. Every time they use the word cool, it means, I don't know, it means something that's supposed to be positive. I don't know if it's still positive because language is evolving so fast. I don't know if, since yesterday, if cool is now has a different meaning than what I knew when I was a kid. So it is evolving. And as you know, young people today have their own language. They use vocabulary words that we might have used, or at least every generation has its own vocabulary, its own usage of the same word, but with a different meaning or different connotation. So that needs to be kept in mind. So that's what I did when I translate. I said, okay, first of all, I'm going to go back and understand, let's translate these Quranic words based on the root meanings. What did this root word mean at the time that the Quran was revealed in the context of the usage by the Prophet Muhammad? How did he understand this word when this word was used, and what did it mean at that time? When we did that, when I did that, and when we do that, the meanings are very different. You see quite a contrast between how it's translated, which a lot of times doesn't sound cohesive. It sounds like it's all over the place, and how the Quran was actually intended to be understood as this extremely powerful book. You know, that is provoking deeper thought and provoking higher levels of intellect and cooperation.
I guess, Mohammed, what I'm trying to find out is how radical a reading you have made of the Quran, or how well accepted your translation is by your colleagues. Do you find agreement on the book essentially being the title of the Quran would be like the blossoming?
Correct. My so far as you've seen with the life of the Quran, it was blurred by the Grand Mufti of Aleppo. It was also blurred by the dean of the Department of Sharia at Aleppo University and several other Islamic scholars. I've had several high-ranking imams from around the world also love the books, so I haven't had any issue in that regard. And in fact, the biggest thing that I remember as a child when I was becoming an imam in my work was how often my teachers called for a proper translation of the Quran. Because yes, you have all these translations, but the reality is they're not really translations of the Quran. Because what happens, I do speak about it briefly in the introductions, is the first translations of the Quran were done around the turn of the past century, right? And the people who were translating them, they were neither Islamic scholars nor experts in the Arabic language, nor had the background to understand that. So a lot of these translations were done by people from the subcontinent who spoke Urdu, who looked at Urdu translations of Persian commentaries on the Quran, so they didn't actually have access to the original Arabic. And based on these commentaries that were doctrinal, that had their own religious inclinations, they took these as their means to translate the book. And a lot of people who do translate, what they do is they take the works that have already been done, and maybe they change a word or two, and they tweak it here and there, and they put their name on it. If someone wants to do, and if you look at all these translations, in most cases, people dish out a translation in a year or two, and then it's like, oh, here I have a new translation. There are tons of translations. There are over 30 translations, and they all sound more or less the same.
Right.
what we're looking for, and that's what I'm basically hoping people would see through the books, is that the Quran has never been translated, and the Quran deserves a translation worthy of the power of its meaning, because these translations are not conveying the depth and the nuances and the dynamism of the Quran.
Yeah.
And unless you go back to the original root meanings, unless you go back and understand what do these original Arabic words mean, what did they mean at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and then what's the closest equivalent in our modern understanding of these concepts, it's not going to make sense. I speak about the concept of mindset. So mindset sounds modern,
Yes.
right? Okay, but the word the Quran uses many, many times is fikr. So the root word is FKR, fikr. يتفكرون لقوم يتفكرون لعلهم يتفكرون. So يتفكرون ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات يتفكرون. So what does the word يتفكرون mean? Fakara is the mind, the way that the workings of the mind. So يتفكرون means that they build this mindset. So fikr is the mindset. Well, that's what the word means. That's the root word. That's the concept, and that's how I translate it. In terms of the concept of the Quran as blossoming, then, and I do in the life of the Quran in the sourcing section, I give a long list of how the Arab of the word qara'a, the root word qara'a, how it's used in lexicons, in ancient Arabic lexicons, and the concept is associated with blossoming. Say qara'at al-riyah, which means that the wind has fertilized the earth. So if you're going to translate as reading, it means the wind was reading. I mean, I don't know, the last time I checked, winds don't read and don't recite. Or qara'at al-mar'a, the woman gave a healthy birth. She gave birth to a healthy child. No, the woman in labor didn't read. Or qara'at al-azhar, the flowers, the blossoms blossomed. They didn't read. So yes, reading becomes associated. The word qara'a is later used in association with reading because of the Quran. So because the Quran, so basically it becomes associated with the concept of reading. As a result, if you look at some of the Arabic lexicons, I have some of them behind me, they talk about the root of the word qara'a in terms of its association with this birthing, right? So blossoming is this birth, opening, and then later on it's associated with reading or reciting or etc. because it is connected to the Quran. So that's the inversion.
Yeah.
So the root image, as you spoke very clearly about, is the Quran is coming to an illiterate people who don't have a literary system. The Arabs had no books. They had no books. There were no books published. The Quran is actually, this is a fact, if you want to have a trivia fact, the Quran is the first book ever written in the Arabic language. It's really important to appreciate what that is. Unless you believe in the theory that the book of Job in the Bible, in the Tanakh, was originally written in Arabic, which nobody can really prove. But if you believe in that theory, then maybe that is the first book ever written in Arabic. But the reality is the confirmed, the only book that we know of ever written in the Arabic language is the Quran. This is the first ever.
First.
So there's no precedent to its being written. So it's coming to an illiterate people. So it's not talking about reading and educating yourself becomes secondary meanings to that. Because if you want to reach blossoming, you need to educate yourself. But the primary target, that's why it's called Al-Quran, it is the blossoming. Its purpose is to help you blossom, to unleash your dormant potential.
The Quran is divided into chapters, surahs, I guess is the word, that range in length from several pages to a few lines.
Correct.
And the way that they're organized is always very complicated for a stranger to the book like me some years ago when I first looked at the Quran. Roughly, the surahs range from the longest ones to the shortest ones. But they're not organized chronologically. And
Correct.
what you've done in your books
Mhm.
is tell the story of Muhammad, who has these moments of connection with the divine, when he's the moments of revelation, and chronologically, the ideas that are being addressed in many of these revelatory uh, uh, messages through him
Yeah.
relate to things that are happening in his life and relate to things that are happening in Mecca and then Medina.
Correct. Yes.
So that what your books do is restore a chronological order to something that's, and I gather the Prophet Muhammad himself said he didn't want any biographies written about him. So you're on thin ice here.
Yes.
And, it is more understandable in that chronological order than in the order that Muhammad himself set up in the last months of his life.
Yes.
How important is that to your project?
Well, the Quran in the order that it's in is divided in a particular thematic manner. So the reason when you look at the translations of the Quran and read them, it doesn't make sense. It looks like a jumble. It's like, oh my God, what's going on here? Like you read the first chapter, Al-Fatiha. If you look at the translation, it almost sounds like a 5-year-old wrote it. It sounds so basic, like seriously. But the Fatiha is considered the most powerful chapter in the Quran. It is extremely deep in meaning and connotation. Al-Fatiha literally means the unlocking. So its purpose is to unlock the secrets of the Quran. And if you look at the way I translated, and of course the way I translated doesn't convey all the meanings. It's only one layer of nuance because there are so many nuances that are contained within each word. But it gives you, then you're like, oh, this sounds more cohesive. It sounds it's I can see how this is a lot and unlocking. I can see how this is a key to help me understand the Quran. I can see how this can be used as a source of guidance for my life. I can see how this is a source of self-help. Once the Quran is translated properly, in the order that it's formed in right now, it makes perfect sense. The reason it doesn't make sense is because it hasn't been translated properly. That goes back to my what I was saying again. So what I'm doing in showing people the chronological order of the Quran and the context of revelations, I'm showing people that look, you can't understand the Quran. You cannot create a translation like the ones that I'm creating without knowing this. And the people who are translating the Quran don't have that background, unfortunately. So that's why they're unable to put these things together. So it's important to have that background, have the background of the language, the context, the world in which it was spoken, etc., to make sense of all of these concepts. Because otherwise, they're not going to work together. You know, I'll give you an example. Maybe I'm overreaching right now, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay. So if you look at the translations of parts of the Jewish scripture, you have one of my favorite parts is Al Naharot Bavel, by the rivers of Babylon.
Yes.
All right. Al Naharot Bavel Sham Yeshavnu Gam Bakhinu Bizukhrenu Etzion العرفين بتخاتلين كنورتين كشام شلون شوفينو دفرشير وتولالين سمحة. So let's go back. Gambachino. So they translate it as we cried. So I'm saying that no, if you go back to the root of the root word gam in Hebrew, and it's the same word in Arabic, jam, the root image is to sway with deep emotion. So now look at this. Okay, what makes more sense? Translating it as also we cried. So let's it starts, okay, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and we cried, right? All right. So what makes more sense if you think of it in terms of the language? Let's go back to the roots of the language. Also we cried, or we cried with swaying emotion. That's literally the word jamma, the same word in the Quran that the Quran uses.
Probably Gam in Egypt.
Oh, yes. تحبون المال حبا جما. The Quran talks about the emotional, how much people love wealth. They love wealth, money with so much emotion. They're shaking with the love they have for money, like the intense lust for wealth. This gem is what is a swaying with emotion. It's showing, you see the image. Now you see the difference. Okay, let's go to the beginning of the Torah. I'm giving an example because it's nice to see the parallels, because the Quran and the Torah, the Quran and the Tanakh, the Jewish scriptures, they're both Semitic. Whether it's Arabic, Hebrew, or Aramaic, they are Semitic. They come from they share an original root language, root concept. So the roots are what they share. The trees might look different, but they have the same roots at the end of the day. There's one root. You can have a tree with so many different branches. You can, add things to it, etc. But let's start with the Torah. برشيت برا إلهيم إتها شمايم وإتها آرس. All right. So here we have, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. That's how they translate it. Okay, now let's look. Berashit. So the word Rashid comes from the root in the word is Rish, or Rosh, which is the head, the climax. So is it the beginning? Or is it the climax? Is Rosh Hashanah the beginning of the year? Or is it the climax of the year? Let's go back and see how these people saw it. It's not the beginning. So the word Rosh, Birashit, indicates that the universe has existed for a long time before this moment. This is not the beginning moment. That's the first. The second thing it says is bara. What does the root word bara? The bara is used in the Quran. I show you in here as well. And in here, the root word bara is used in the Quran. It's used to describe God. It's one of God's creation, one of God's characteristics. It's also the name of one of the Quranic chapters that is the most understood. Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9, that everybody always likes to play with. Chapter 9, verse 11, which all this, I remember after September 11th, everybody wanted to play on chapter 9, because chapter 9 is the most misunderstood chapter in the Quran, which is really fascinating, because it's the first word in Surah 9 is bara'a, the same root word. And the root word bara is to reform something, to create something, to remodel something from something that's already existing. So imagine the concept of the way this chapter is written, the beginning. These are the nuances that are being missed, that I'm trying to show in the Quran. Basically, this is the equivalent, that you see that there are all these nuances in the root words, in the original Semitic roots, that the language is showing, is giving us all these clues in terms of how we're supposed to understand these concepts.
I have to say that reading your books as a Jewish reader, I knew that Jews figure in the story of Muhammad and the story of Mecca and Medina, but I was surprised by how much we, if I may, figured in the life of Mecca and Medina, and how many rabbis, in some way, were close to either Muhammad or early Muslims. You write that when Muhammad, who originally is from Mecca, flees and this becomes the leader of Medina, another city, and eventually after they attack him, the Meccans let him come back, and he arrives as their ruler. And you say that special freedoms were noted in the charter of
Correct.
for Zoroastrians and for Christians. And you say they didn't bother with one for the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Just assume that the Jews were part of the majority community, that
They were, exactly.
just
Because,
like anyone else we
correct.
now call Muslims. Yes.
Yes. Because when the Charter of Medina, Mithaq al-Medina, was chartered by the Prophet Muhammad, and he arrived in Medina. Basically, it was called Yathrib and was changed to Medina. This is in the year 622. The charter calls the followers, everybody who's the people who are signing the charter, as part of one ummah. Innahum ummatun wahida. So they are what? They are one ummah, one community, one people. So the Quran is this basically this concept of the ummah, which is also mentioned in the Quran, is describing, for example, the Quran talks about all the Jewish prophets, the Hebrew prophets, all of them, right, one by one, and it says that they are one ummah. They are one. These are all part of the same commune, part of the same nation. So the Quran does not see itself as coming in a vacuum. The Quran sees itself as a continuation of the message. The Quran sees itself as the reclaimer. Talk about reclaiming. The Quran sees itself as the reclaimer of the original spirit of the Torah that it believes had been mostly forgotten. So the spirit of the Torah is what the Quran is trying to reclaim. So the second chapter you talked about in terms of how the Quran is arranged, the second chapter in the Quran is called Al-Baqarah, which and the word baqar in Arabic means to dig deeper. That's where you get the word boqir tov in Hebrew. You know, it's like good morning. Boqir is to basically dig deeper. And then this is the baqar, is the horn of the cow, right? Because it almost like opens. So we're talking about the morning is when the light splits through the darkness. So it's an opening, and it's basically an impact. So I translate Al-Baqarah as the lasting impact, because that's the concept. It is something that you dig deep, you're plowing into the earth, you're planting a seed, and you're creating a lasting impact. So the Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter in the Quran, which is also the longest chapter in the Quran, depending on, you know, the calligrapher who wrote it, it can go up to 48 or even 50 pages. So it's the longest chapter in the Quran. And the Surah Al-Baqarah is basically a commentary and a synopsis of Jewish history, the Torah, etc.
So
That's basically it.
where do
For
we
the
get
most part.
this very fraternal relationship and not hostile? This is not even when there we go. We lost him. How do we get from there to people reading verses like "Do not consider the Jews and Christians as your friends," as a line from Quran? You say somebody's playing with translation here.
Correct, and that's why I give you in my books I actually address these problematic verses, and I say, okay, this is how they're translated, and I'm going to show you how they're supposed to be translated. I actually take them back to the roots in the life of the Quran, and I translate them based on the original meaning. See, let's see what the words in this chapter mean and what they're actually talking about, and what's the context of this verse. And we see saying something completely different than the way they are being translated. And remember that the Quranic translations for the last century and a bit have been done in the context of defense, right? So where these Muslim translators to a large part, even the Western translators who are copying them, are come from a position of defense, or where or copying the style of the King James Bible, etc. So you have all of these aspects that are covering and concealing the original meanings, the root meanings. So that's why when I did my translation, okay, let's go back. We're gonna strip all of these things. I've memorized and studied hundreds of books on exegesis, tafsir, and hadith, etc. What the scholars have said, the different schools. I'm going to, I'm aware of it. I'm going to put it to the side. That this is, now I'm going to allow the Quran to speak for itself. What do these words actually mean? What do these root words mean? How were they understood? And then let's see where we came from here and where we got to the doctrinal aspect. It's kind of like anyone who knows history knows that Jesus, Yeshua, was Jewish.
Yeah.
Like, it's common sense. He lived among the Jewish people. He spoke Aramaic because that was the language of the time, and he was a rabbi. He studied in the Beit Midrash, etc. So he was a rabbi. He was a Jewish rabbi. He was Jewish. He spoke to a Jewish people. The parables that he used were all Semitic parables. They were Jewish parables, things that his Jewish audience would understand. So there are many people today, if you tell them that Jesus Christ was Jewish, they would get offended. Right. There are people today, who would get offended if you tell them that Jesus, son of Mary, was Jewish. That and his followers were Jewish. I mean, the Last Supper was what?
It's Passover, or it's around Passover.
Pesach. That's literally what it was. It's a Seder. So, and etc. And even if you look at the Orthodox Christian tradition, the Orthodox Christians, the dress of the Orthodox priests, clergy resembles the dress and the style of what? Of the priests of the temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So you have these parallels, but in the same way, for whatever I do speak about it in the books, towards the end, in terms of how things evolve and the politicization of ideas, etc. But as time passes, the original teachings are generally forgotten, and especially when ideas are so powerful and so potent. And and even talk about it in the life of the Quran, how as the Prophet Muhammad is dying, you have a man called Musaylim, and you have a whole bunch of prophet claimants all around Arabia trying to claim the legacy for themselves for power. They're interested in the message. They're like, oh, this is a powerful message. Let me try to manipulate it for power and wealth and gain. And we see that. That's one of the last things that the Prophet Muhammad experiences. And it's really interesting that in his final sermon, he's telling people, when I die, don't go killing each other and don't descend into rivalry and murder and destruction. Don't do that, because he can foresee that that's what's going to happen.
What happens. Yes.
Oh, and he tells them, make sure you uphold the rights of women, because he knows they're not going to do that. He says, oh, make sure that you are not racist and you're not prejudiced, and a white man is not superior to a black man. An Arab is not superior to a non-Arab, because he knows what's going to happen. Because what happens after the Prophet Muhammad, especially during the Umayyad period, you have a very Arab-centric empire where non-Arabs are treated as second class. We're not talking about non-Muslims, not talking non-Arabs in general. We're treated as second class. The Persian language was banned in Persia, etc. So you have all of these things happening, which are in contrast to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and the teachings of the Quran. So you see these things happening, which is, I mean, it happens in any faith or any tradition, that things evolve, that things change for whatever reason. And basically what I'm trying to do through the books is at least help people reclaim that message. So what really happened? Who was the Prophet Muhammad? What were his teachings? What did he really want to happen? And how did it go wrong? And how can we reclaim that today?
And what you find and what you describe is someone who is terribly put off by the stagnation of his times,
Correct.
and who sees no energy, whether it's commercial, intellectual, spiritual, whatever, in Mecca, in the place where he is born, who becomes the vehicle for divine revelations.
Yes.
His message is all about fairness and striving, and be all that you can be. I mean, it's very much and a very, as you write, for his time and for any time,
Yes.
feminist, remarkably feminist. I just wanted to mention very briefly the a measure that all scripture obviously has a struggle to have people obey it
Yes.
or listen. One thing to have a sacred book. It's another thing for people to obey it. And I found the worst case of obedience that you write about is that the Quran frowns on people saying inshallah,
Yes.
may it be God's will, which is, I think, in my limited travels in Muslim,
Mhm.
the phrase I have heard more than any other
Yes.
from people, inshallah, and evidently not a good thing because it's waiting for divine help rather than taking the initiative.
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah. Um, I could go on for a long time with you, but there are
So
people.
on that note, I usually, when I'm speaking with Jews, I say, don't say Im Yirsa Hashem, say Be'izrat Hashem. Because Im Yirsa Hashem would be like, Insha'Allah. It's like, if, Hashem wills it. I say, no, don't say that. Say Be'izrat Hashem. I'm going to do it with the, like God's going to help me facilitate it, but I'm going to do it. Because the concept is, I will do it illa an yasha'Allah. I'm going to do it. So you say, I'm going to commit unless God has other plans for me. But when you say, if God wills it to happen, then I'll do it, you're almost saying, well, you know what? God has to force me to do it. So therefore, in itself, it becomes a form of stagnation because it becomes a form of waiting for God to do the work for you. But the Quran reminds us so many times that you need to do the action. And then God will help you. Like God will help you, but like you have to do the action yourself. God's not going to change your state. It says that about in terms of the concept of the Quran. It says that God does not change the state of a people حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم until and unless they change that which is within themselves. What is within themselves? Their mindset, the way they think, the way they view the world. You start there, and then you change yourself, and then you can change your world. Then God will help you. God's not going to come and change your world. So this concept of waiting for a Mashiach, waiting for a Messiah, waiting for an external savior, Islam said, the Quran says, don't do that. An external savior will come after you facilitated it. Things will fall into place after you've done the work. So you have to do the work first. Don't stagnate. Don't be reliant on an external force.
Well, Reb Jebara, thank you so much.
You're so funny.
And I should have I thank you for your singing as well, by the waters of Babylon and Bereshit Bara, the beginning of the book of Genesis, as well in Hebrew. It's been an education reading and talking with you, and I'm going to hand off to Suzanne to see if our listeners have something to ask.
Great.
Always a pleasure, Robert. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much for that. Someone wanted to know how much did the study of the Tanakh help you with translating the Quran?
It was very, very important to me. I completed my memorization of the Quran when I was 12. And because I was in this, I was almost it's like what they say, I had a high of memorization. So I was on this high of memorization. My brain was almost on steroids. So I decided to teach myself Hebrew. I went to the local library, got some books. I learned how to read and write Hebrew. It took me about 20 minutes because I just took the knowledge and the style I had that I had used in memorizing the Quran and learning it, and I scaled it to the same thing with Hebrew. And actually, the first book that I started reading was a Haggadah, and then I began reading into the Torah, delving into Hebrew roots, lexicons, etc. And the more I read, the more it helped me make sense of things in the Quran. What I realized is the Quran and the Torah, putting them side by side, they shed light on each other. So much in the Torah that doesn't make sense. When you look at the translation, that doesn't make sense. Like, why is it saying that? Why is it saying that in this place? And you need these nuances have been preserved in the Quran. I use those nuances to make sense of things in the Torah and the Tanakh. And things in the Tanakh come and help me make sense of things in the Quran. I actually do speak about it in both books. For example, in the Quran, there's this concept of muhaymin, which is very strange because the Islamic scholars who tried to understand it were really struggling to understand what does this concept of muhaymin mean. They guessed, etc., but they couldn't really understand it. So I went to the Tanakh and I realized that the root muhaymin, is mentioned only 2 times in the entire Tanakh, just like it's mentioned 2 times in the entire Quran. And the 2 times that it's mentioned in the Tanakh is in the book of Daniel. And the 2 times in the Tanakh, in the book of Daniel, correspond to the 2 times that it's mentioned in the Quran. And I do actually speak about it. I'm not going to give you the full details. If you want to read about it, it's in the life of the Quran, But that is an example. I do give several examples in my books where these things made sense. For example, even the Prophet Muhammad's name that comes from the Tanakh. It's mentioned in several places. It's in the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirin, which is one of my favorites as well, and other books. And, these concepts help explain each other. They help make sense of each other. So you put them side by side and they help you understand what are the nuances, what are the connotations that are missing. And it's important to remember, when you look at the history, you had a period during Jewish history when the Kohen Gadol, the great priest at the temple in Jerusalem, didn't even know Hebrew or Aramaic. He was just speaking Greek, right? So you've had these situations where there was a disconnect from the original Semitic language, and the Hellenization of the Jewish people, especially after the time of Alexander, did have an impact on the way the language evolved. The same thing will happen with Islam as well, with the Quran. So we need to always go back to the original roots, and the original roots will help clarify.
Right. So take going from that, how did so many of the words change so drastically from positive to negative, and that so many people who follow Islam take the words in a whole entirely different direction?
So first of all, I think it's important to be accurate in the way we describe this concept. It's not the majority. So the majority, I believe that I speak for the silent majority. So what I've traveled the world. I have trained thousands of imams around the world, and I know that this is the message that the majority of Muslims believe in and uphold. What I speak about, what is presented in these books, is the message of the majority of Muslims. Unfortunately, people who tend to be more extreme tend to be much louder, have louder voices, have a larger impact, especially on the internet and especially in the printing of books. With the printing of books, so many things have been manipulated. I can show you, I've actually done this in classes where I've shown people copies of books of hadith, which are compilations of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings, printed in the 1920s, or even, around the turn of the century, around 1902, 1903, so during the time of the Ottoman Empire. And compare the same book printed later on in the 1960s, 1970s, basically after the 1950s. And so many of the original hadith are actually removed. In one really famous book that everybody knows, they removed over 300 of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings because they don't agree with the dominant narrative today. And in many places, they actually changed the words. And I will show you, it's really fascinating. For example, there's a surah, the chapter in the Quran called Surah Bani Israel. And I do speak about it in both books. In the sourcing sections, I show you that the chapter for all of Islamic history was known as Surah Bani Israel, Surah to Bani Israel. Always, if you look at all the manuscripts. So all the modern books that are printed, they remove Surah Bani Israel and they call it Surah Al-Isra, because they want to remove the word Israel, because they don't want people to know that the word Israel is in the Quran, even though it's mentioned all over the Quran. Even the Quran says about the Israel's Bani Israel, أني فضلتكم على العالمين. The God in the Quran says that God has chosen the children of Israel above all the people of the world. That's what the Quran says. So they are chosen people for a particular purpose, not once, not twice, 3 times. So these concepts, yes.
But I just interrupt you. Also in the historical life of the Jewish people who had been banned from Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
it is the
Muslims who bring them back.
Muslims who invite the Jews to return to Jerusalem, which was probably also not a popular sentiment in the 1950s.
Of course, definitely. You had Umar ibn Khattab. When Umar takes Jerusalem the first time, he invites the Jews back. He actually goes to Jerusalem with a rabbi and a group of Jewish elders. When Salahuddin Saladin goes to take Jerusalem, he takes a group of, including Maimonides, who was one of his closest associates and friends. And by the way, speaking of Maimonides and myself share a chain of transmission. We actually, in my chain of transmission, my teacher in my chain of transmission was the colleague of Maimonides, because they studied from the same scholar, Ali ibn Hudayl, in Cordoba. So when Maimonides was 10 years old, during the time that the Muwahhidun took over and they forced conversion on people, Maimonides' family had to pretend to be Muslim. So Maimonides' father's friend was one of basically my teachers, the master of the teacher that I'm through in my chain of transmission. He taught Maimonides the Quran, memorized the Quran through. So basically, Maimonides was able to chant the way I do. He was able to chant the Quran and memorize it with a chain of transmission linking to the Prophet Muhammad. And the same Maimonides is going to later become a very important figure in the in the history of Islam, in terms of his association with Salahuddin and in terms of association with many important figures. So there was this cooperation and mutual respect that all people are not fully aware of, but these are all stories that are important for rebuilding dialogue and rebuilding trust. Because once there's brokenness, you have to repair the brokenness. And as we speak about it in the Quran, in the books, right? The Quran speaks about it as well. The concept of Islam, Salima, which is about repairing cracks, is about striving for a state of completion. That's where you get the name Shlomo from, for Solomon. Of course, Solomon is the greatest builder. He's the builder of the great city of Jerusalem. The Quran talks about that entire story, about all the things that Solomon built in Jerusalem and the magnificence and the civilization that he had built. So all about rebuilding cracks. And now when you have cracks because of conflicts or misunderstanding, the way we reclaim and heal these cracks is by going back and reclaiming the original messages, original wisdoms that are there ingrained in plain sight, hidden in plain sight in the teachings of the Torah, the teachings of the Tanakh, of the prophets, the teachings of the Quran, and even in the Gospels as well.
Thank you. Real quickly, as we wrap up, one, I wanted to let people know I put Mohamad's website in the chat, and so I encourage people to visit there, and you can find both of his books on his website. But how have in general Muslims responded to your books, and how can these books be used and studied with Jews and Muslims together to help build relationships? Like, what are your hopes for how this book can be used in multiple communities?
Well, my hope is that these books will be incorporated into curricula, become part of the curriculum, teaching ethics or teaching religion, etc., across the world in different schools. They should be used in book clubs where people can come together, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, even atheists, just come together and read and see, okay, what lessons can we extract from these? Because at the end of the day, the purpose of these books is to universalize and make accessible the wisdom that has long been obscured, and to reclaim it. It's not just to reclaim it for Muslims, to reclaim it for all people. At least my understanding so far is that the books have had a positive response from a lot of Muslims. Of course, you can have people who don't like it, which is understandable. No book's going to be universally accepted by anyone. The Quran itself is a perfect example, and I think overall it's positive, because the people who are seeing benefit and value in the books are people who need that benefit and that value, and people who are not seeking it are not going to find it. So I think that in the end, the people who are looking for that wisdom and looking for the reclamation of these teachings are going to find it. I don't, and one thing I would like to clarify, I don't see myself as a modernist or a reformer in any way, shape, or form. I am a reclaimer. I'm a traditional. I look at Islam traditionally, and whatever sounds modernistic is because, I'm sorry, like the Quran spoke about it first. So if anything, it's not modern, it's actually ancient. This is ancient wisdom that I'm just reclaiming. And I mean, I could do that with the Torah as well. I can show you, if we had time, and I could go through even the first parsha or the second parsha of Berashit, and you can see all the amazing wisdoms that are ingrained in every word that you tend to lose in translation when you don't go back to the original root words. There's so much wisdom that we can extract and we can benefit from, And I mean, you can do the same thing with the Hindu tradition. Many of the mantras that were written, I've actually been studying Sanskrit and memorizing mantras for the last several years. And when you look at the roots of these words and what they actually meant, and the wisdom for day-to-day living, it's phenomenal. So I believe that there's wisdom everywhere, and you don't necessarily have to be a Jew or to appreciate the Torah. You don't have to be a Muslim to appreciate the Quran. You don't have to be a Hindu to appreciate some of these fascinating mantras that were written over 3,000 years ago, or even some of the works written by ancient Egyptians or the ancient Greeks or the ancient Chinese, or whatever the case may be. There's wisdom in all traditions, and I think that wisdom at the end of the day is universal and belongs to all people.
Thank you. That's fabulous. And we're so glad that you were able to join us for this conversation. Thank you, Robert. I do know, Mohamad, when we had talked, when we did some prep meetings earlier this week, you said one of your favorites to chant is the Song of Songs. And I wonder if before we go, if you wanted to give us a little bit of that.
Oh, I'd be happy to. شیر هشیریم أشر لشلومو يشقيني مشقيات بيهو كي طوفيم دودي خميين لريح شمني خطوفيم شمن تراق شمخا علكن على موت أهفوخا مشقيني أحاريخا نروصا هذياني همالخ حدراو نقيلة ونسمي حباخ نسكي ردو دي خميين كش مشاريم أهفوخا. I don't want to keep going to the end because it's a little long, but that gives you a little example.
Real quickly, someone wanted to know what nusach you use when you chant Hebrew.
I just I'm mostly like Sephardic tropes, and the I would say more or less Yerushalayimi, so the Jerusalemite rhythms, and the pronunciation. I'm also using the older pronunciation as well, so I pronounce the w instead of the v, the qa, the ta, so all of these older pronunciations. So. And I mean, when you do that, you see it doesn't sound that different from Arabic. I mean, it's a Semitic language.
Very nice. All right, well, Imam Mohamad Jebara, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for this. Thank you, Robert Siegel. We will have this up on our website tomorrow, so please share with others. We'll send a link to the recording to everyone as well, and go to his website to buy his books. Thank you so much, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you so much for having me with you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Mohammed.